Hello, this is the Watchman's Journal, and I'm Sean McMullen. Today I want to focus your attention on dismantling moral justifications of modern Jim Crow. After the Civil War, the ratification of the 13th Amendment, the end of slavery and involuntary servitude, the 14th Amendment, birthright citizenship, due process, equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment, the right to vote, made the old ways of subjugation unconstitutional. But the majority culture developed creative legal and social tools to achieve the same end. They developed the myth of separate but equal. This was the ultimate philosophical pivot. It allowed the country to claim it was following the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause while ensuring total social and physical separation. They developed, secondly, the criminalization of blackness. The 13th Amendment contained a loophole. Slavery was abolished except as punishment for a crime. This led to black codes, vagrancy laws, where black men were arrested for minor and non-existent offenses and leased out to private plantations and mines. They called it convict leasing. They developed then pseudoscience, statements, beliefs, or practices that claim to be scientific or factual, but are incompatible with the scientific method. And then theology. To justify these actions, they engineered new moral justifications. Then there was social Darwinism and scientific racism. They were used to claim that separation was a biological necessity. At the same time, some white religious institutions twisted scripture to argue that racial hierarchy, or the white majority, was divinely ordained. The preservation of the hierarchy was no accident. They were intentional efforts to ensure that the foundational moral philosophy, that is, the belief in white supremacy, remained the operating system of the country. So by the early 20th century, this philosophy was so deeply ingrained that it was reinforced by everything from school textbooks to the layout of American cities. This historical rebranding of oppression in the face of the constitutional law updates meant that the struggle wasn't just for civil rights, but for a fundamental theological and moral shift in how the nation defined humanity. To challenge a dominant philosophy that used the Bible to sanctify subjugation, black pastors and theologians had to develop what we can call a hermeneutic of liberation. They didn't just argue for better laws, they argued for a different God, a God whose character was fundamentally incompatible with the spirit of the founding majority. I want to simply break down some of the specific counter-theologies that emerged to dismantle the moral justifications of Jim Crow. Number one, there was the theology of the Imago Dei, or the image of God. The dominant racial philosophy suggested that black people were lesser by divine design. Black pastors countered this with a radical re-emphasis on Genesis 1:27. Says God created man in his image and likeness, and he created him male and female. He created them. The argument was that if every human was made in the direct image of the Creator, then any system that segregates, degrades, or disenfranchises a person is not just a political error, but blasphemy against God himself. The impact of this teaching in the black church shifted the struggle from asking for rights to asserting a divine reality. We stopped asking to be accepted. It gave the disenfranchised an internal sense that we were, as my mother drilled into me and my sisters, somebody, because God don't make junk. We woke up. We woke up to the truth that we were made in the image of the Creator himself, and the law could not give us identity, and Jim Crow could not take it away. Another counter-theology that emerged from the black church was, number two, the Exodus paradigm. That is, that God is not the enslaver, but the great liberator. While the majority group's theology often focused on a false and biased interpretation of Romans 13, submission to authorities, black theology centered on the Exodus. The black church framed the black experience in America as a contemporary Egypt. We identified God as a deliverer who actively takes sides with the oppressed against the pharaohs of the world. You see, by identifying God as a deliverer, they stripped the majority people group's political leaders of their argument that they had a divine right to rule. The impact of this theological teaching was that it redefined civil disobedience as divine obedience. If God is a liberator, then to resist Jim Crow, to resist oppression, was to align oneself with the will of God. God was fighting on the side of the enslaved and the oppressed, so we were fighting with God. Then there was the theological teaching on, number 3, the suffering servant, or, in other words, the Galilean Jesus. During the Jim Crow era, the majority group often depicted a white Jesus who supported the status quo. Black pastors developed a counter theology centered on the historical marginalized Jesus. The argument they emphasized was that Jesus was a dark-skinned Palestinian Jew living under a brutal Roman occupation, which they described as an ancient form of Jim Crow. He was a man of sorrows who was eventually lynched, we know from Scripture, crucified by the state. The impact of this teaching and the images it emphasized allowed the black community to see their own suffering not as a sign of God's abandonment, but as a sign of their intimacy with Christ. He suffered, we suffer with him. Renowned theologian Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited, is the landmark text that argued that the gospel was a survival kit for those with their backs against the wall. Then, number 4, the black theology proclaimed a prophetic critique of an American church. Perhaps the most biting counter theology was the Watchman stance. This was the idea that the black church was the moral conscience of a backslidden nation. The argument used the language of the prophets, like Amos and Jeremiah, arguing that America was under divine judgment because its foundational philosophy was an idol. The black church asserted that the majority group's religion was a counterfeit because it lacked justice. You see, authentic religion is one that is characterized by the message of justice and the celebration of a just God. The impact of this theological message took the moral high ground away from the majority group, took it away from their spiritual leaders, because many of their spiritual leaders and the mainline churches consistently failed to preach justice and instead preached America. They're still doing it today. This prophetic message framed the black church not as a special interest group, but as the true keeper of the gospel in a pagan land. These counter theologies, beloved of the black theologians, pastors, and the black church, serve as a blueprint today for dismantling America's foundational ghost of the Confederacy that has been resurrected and is attempting to assault the black community at this very hour in history. This is proof that you cannot change the law effectively until you replace the false God that the law was built to serve. I am Sean McMullen, and this is the Watchman's Journal.